Hello, everybody. I've been fascinated by some of the presentations earlier on. I'm probably going to make some of the mistakes that other people have cautioned about, for instance, using slides and bullet points and things like that. But bear with me anyway. I hope it's going to be interesting. What I'm going to try and talk about is remote working and how that's not necessarily as new as lots of people will tell you about. And I'm not going to talk about standing desks or Zoom or headphones or how to deal with your kids or your pets or stress or loneliness. I'm not going to talk about that. Others have talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to. I'm going to try and talk about the work, I guess, and how to try and do it when you're remote. And are there things we can learn from the ancients? Let's put it that way. So first off, who the hell am I? That's my name, Hugh Sheehy. You can email me anytime you like or find me on the website. My claim to fame at the moment is that I was messing with Google's Vision API. I put up the picture you see at the top here, and one of the keywords that came back was innovation. So anybody who's read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy knows that it's one thing to think something about yourself, but it's another thing entirely to have a machine tell you. So I'm going with innovation as my tag for the moment. In terms of what can we learn from the ancients, essentially, I guess it's a couple of things. You know, the challenges of remote working are not particularly new. We have better technology now. I'm talking to people all around the world, but we should be taking advantage of a lot of these things, not reinventing the wheel. And there are valuable lessons to be learned because the ancients, they weren't stupid people most of the time. So I'm trying to pick up, you know, lessons from maybe 3 different time periods and what can we learn from that. Now, in terms of ancient Rome, I think it's, you know, a preeminent example of good organization. I could probably have used Persia or China as other examples. The Industrial Revolution was a huge break in terms of technology and has been really influential in what we consider work and office work. So we got to get into that a little bit. And then now, basically, or recently, and I think maybe we get a bit too focused on things now and not think about the bigger picture. So let's start off with ancient Rome. And most people know about ancient Rome. They were notoriously well-organized bunch of people, and they did not have a single Zoom meeting for the whole time the Roman Empire existed. So how the heck did they stay organized? And, you know, we shouldn't underestimate what these guys achieved either. They had an empire that was multi-ethnic, extremely diverse, multilingual. It was very big, particularly for the time. And they managed to sustain peace for hundreds of years. And, you know, the Pax Romana, if you ever get an era of peace named after you or your company, then let me know, because then I'm impressed. That would be a big deal. And so, you know, we shouldn't underestimate how these guys went about things. Now, again, the Roman Empire, it wasn't a constant for all time. In the beginning of the Roman Empire, it was basically like a company with one great product. These guys had the legions. They went out with the legions, and it was very much project management. Go and kick the heck out of those guys, and they went and kicked the heck out of those guys. And it was like maybe Oracle's sales culture at various times in Oracle's history. I don't really care about the welfare of the client. It's a very simplistic message and a very simplistic mission that I'm giving people. Go do it. And a very a culture that was hungry for conquest. You know, these guys went out and they weren't nice people. They kicked the heck out of everybody. That's what they did. But once they'd done that, they had a much more subtle thing to try and achieve. You know, they had an empire of hundreds of millions of people, or about 100 million people at its peak. It was several thousand kilometers across, and the maximum speed a message could get from one end to the other was 50 to 80 kilometers a day. And you couldn't even sustain that for very long periods of time. So, you know, how did they stay that organized? And if you're curious, the link in the bottom left there is actually to a site on Stanford where they map how long it took a message to get from one side of the empire to another. But they kept this thing going for several hundred years. And it was amazing. And then they started making mistakes. And the decline of the Roman Empire, you know, it's complicated, but micromanagement was an issue. Dishonesty and corruption was an issue. They started getting very internally focused. And they had a lot of top-down rigid policies and micromanagement and hierarchy. And it was pretty grim. I think a lot of people would recognize some of the things that started to happen. Now, a couple of plagues and barbarians didn't help either, but they weren't helping themselves. So what did work? Well, these guys did not have a lot of meetings. They weren't scheduling Zoom meetings all the time. What they did have was very clear mandates or very clear responsibilities given to people. You're in charge of this area for this length of time. Here are the rules you have to live within and their guidance. You're the person who's responsible for this. They had very high levels of delegation and very high levels of trust. Now, to be fair, in the Roman Empire, there were pretty heavy levels of consequence if you didn't live up to the trust, but the delegation was certainly there. They had shared values. It's true. They had a really clear kind of understanding of what they stood for. They had a clear understanding of what they didn't mind in terms of diversity. They didn't really mind what religion you were, or what, after a while, what ethnicity you were. They didn't care, but they did have some shared values. And local consultation was a big deal. Now, most of these things are fairly understood in modern work, right? Fewer meetings. Everybody likes fewer meetings as long as they're actually trying to do anything. Clarity. Everybody likes clarity. But we always talk about delegation. We don't always know what we mean. If you're delegating something, are you delegating it to somebody who can actually do it? Have you enabled them to do it if you're a manager? If you're the person who's being delegated to, are you taking on a task that you can actually do because people will be depending on you? And the last one I think is maybe interesting these days because people don't necessarily like that anymore, writing stuff down. I was happy to see GitLab yesterday talking about writing stuff down. And they said it's really important. It's hugely important. Actually write it down. You got to clarify things. And that doesn't mean sending tons of emails to people. I'll show my favorite cartoon on that topic later. But it does mean get it agreed in writing. And it's funny for me in my career, I'm getting a bit on the old side. I only started coming across this horrible phrase, sign off, in the 2010s, because before that I'd worked in cultures or corporate cultures where everybody was committed to clarity and sign off all the time. So it wasn't a problem. You didn't need to capture somebody and get them to sign it off. And I think that's a great example of meaning what you say. And again, if we look at what didn't work, this is a description of what started to happen to the Roman Empire. And if you're working in a lot of office organizations, this will sound familiar. Divided, minute portions, lots of presidents and inferior officers, lots of control, too much control. There was an awful lot of that stuff happening in the world back then too, and it was a mistake. And again, if we talk about what happened to the Roman Empire, Skype didn't let them down. Bad headsets on Zoom wasn't the problem. And if you look at that list of things, I'm not going to try and write through it. I've been in meetings online or in offices where all of those things were being done. And I've been in meetings online and in offices where none of those things were being done. And there's a big difference between them. If you have an effective, happy company culture, working from home isn't that difficult. If you have a company culture where these things happen, working from home starts being a problem. And if it doesn't work, well, this is a painting of the dark ages. It's also what it feels like if a company fails. Now, coronavirus isn't going to send us back to the dark ages, but if your company breaks because it can't work, this is what it's going to feel like. Anybody who's been through it will know. So try and get stuff done clearly. And this, I think, is the big point. The Roman Empire wasn't an industrial power. The barbarians on horses could make swords just as well as Rome could. Rome stayed up because it was well organized, and it fell because it got disorganized and started to do all the wrong things in terms of remote working. And that was a problem, and that's what happened to them. Next one is I think where a lot of how we think about work and even office work these days come from was the industrial age. And everybody in a big factory. And that's how we think of offices as being big factories. And I think there's a distinction we need to think of as we go through this. Was the modern office was designed to do clerical work. It wasn't designed to do thinking work. And there's a big difference between clerical administrative work and thinking work. And most of what we do in the world these days in offices is one and not the other. And so a lot of the models people have in their heads of how offices should operate, it's just wrong. It's technologically obsolete. And it's important to understand why. And so if we think again, let's think of the Industrial Revolution. Europe was where most of it happened, but there was also lots of manufacturing in China, in Japan, and in the US, and it spread all over the world. Now, why was it so concentrated? Is because, it was heavy machinery. These are not things you can have a loom or a steam or forge or anything else. In case anybody hears anything, the dogs have come back in. Hello, dogs. You can't have those things in your house. And it needed specific local resources. You couldn't have a factory where there wasn't coal. You couldn't have a factory where there wasn't iron. It was important to have those things locally. And the other one was there was no such thing as a computer simulation. So the R&D they did on products and systems was physical. And that's what factories were like. And they became the office, the model for offices. But if we look, even the Brexit debate recently told us, factories have changed. The Brexit debate told us about just-in-time supply chains, offices all over the place, all over Europe. They're often very small and they're not close to the original model of a factory. They're just not. Whereas if we look at offices, even super cool offices, they're still factories to put people into. And we need to remember lean and agile were invented in manufacturing, and they're there and it works. They're very effective. And there's a lovely quote, which I'll put on the slides afterwards, but developing a well-trained, flexible workforce, product designs that are easy to build with high quality, and a supportive, high-performance supplier network was a description for agile and lean that an American guy wrote up in the 1980s about what he'd seen in Japan in the 60s and 70s. And still, we're way behind that, I think, with most of how we do office work. So why did factories change and why did offices remain the same? Well, power became available everywhere. You didn't need to be beside the coal mill. Transport became cheap. You could move stuff around. We understood what specialization meant and what multiple suppliers meant and what they did. So it was a big deal. Offices have changed too. Now you can have telephones everywhere. Communications is cheap, but we haven't really gotten around to specialization and to delegation, and we haven't done that properly yet. And that's where the difficulty comes up with remote working. I'm just going to try and show a couple of quick pictures. One is, if you guys can see this, it's an old Ford factory. Now this is still in the middle of construction. You can see the massive area it occupied. It was 1.6 by 2.4 kilometers. And this here is what a section of it looked like. Its own power mills, its own coal. That's a ship coming into the middle of the site. And in contrast, let's look at what the inside of the McLaren factory looks like today. Those are very, very different things. It's just not the same. Now, again, factories have changed, offices haven't. And it's basically because we still haven't gotten our hands around this in terms of how we outsource things to people. An example on the manufacturing side, this image up here is a map of the suppliers for 3 different airplanes, airliners. Blue is the A320, which is essentially a European plane. Green is the Boeing 737, an American one, and red is a Chinese, a Comac C-19. And here you can see where the suppliers come from, right? Even for the A320, nearly 40% of it's made in the US. And this is not just made in the US, this is designed in the US. The inputs come from the US. Everything is done, scattered all over the place. The 737 is much more heavy in the US, but let's look at a Chinese airliner. The biggest single supplier, nearly half of parts, is in the US. It's done like that. This is remote working taken to its extreme. It's an example of what's possible. And even if we look at the iPhone, this is an iPhone. The vast majority of the suppliers are in East Asia, but huge numbers in the US, quite a few in Europe, and scattered all over the heck. Now, my question, I guess, to anybody who says remote working is difficult is, are you trying to do anything that's as big and complicated as an airliner? No, I doubt it. And what we are doing a lot these days is targeted to end up on a small little screen. And how can it be harder to do something like that just because there's a little extra distance between the desks? It makes no sense. So we have to concentrate on something else that's going on and how we should do work differently. And again, I'll use Apple. I haven't worked with Apple, so I don't know. But if this is accurate of lots of office cultures, one has to wonder why a company as advanced as Apple has just finished recently building one of the biggest office buildings in the world. It seems counterintuitive. Or why did Marissa Mayer, who went from Google to Yahoo, ban working from home in 2013, I think it was? And there's 2 possibilities. One is that they're badly organized, and the other is that somehow creativity is only possible if everybody's together. And I don't believe that that's true. So somewhere along the line, we're badly organized, and we have to figure out how to do that better. So I come back to, what does the evolution of factory teach us about home working? Can you give the job to someone, and can you let them do the job? Can you make it clear enough what it is they're supposed to do? And if it's not clear, help them out. And specialize on what you're good at and get people to help you with the other things. Now, biggest thing, I guess, that's different, and I know it's a pained subject, what's the productivity of a developer? Factories had and have very clear output metrics. So if you've got a problem organizing your business, it's probably because you don't know what your output metrics are. And if you don't know what those are, you've got a bigger problem. Working from home or working from an office, you've still got a problem. And I think that's the summary one is, factories needed specific local resources and they don't anymore, and they've moved on. And offices started needing specific local resources, but they haven't really moved on. And it's important to understand why. And it's not because we don't have Zoom, it's because we're not well enough organized. The last one I'm going to try and talk about is the 90s and the noughties and now. That's pretty recent. So what's going on? And one of the things I guess that's important is, we're very close to the present. The present's very close to us. And so, we need to cut through a lot of the noise and concentrate on what's actually happening that's important, what's actually changing things around us. And so for me, there's been a lot going on, right? The dot-com bubble, the first one, the subsequent ones, the crash in 2008, AWS came on, which changed the whole technology world. Smartphones came along, which changed the way we live our lives. Coronavirus has just happened. But it's really broadband that's made the difference. Broadband arriving has changed everything more than smartphones, at least as much as smartphones. And that's telecommunications. It's not the internet. It's we can communicate with each other even more easily than in the past. And that speaks back to we can now distribute the work supposedly a lot more efficiently. And we're not always doing that. And I think part of the reason for that is we've allowed broadband to change the way we communicate, and not always in a good way. So whereas previously there was an expectation of talking to somebody, am I getting told something here? No, hold on, I'm going to go back to that. I am getting told something. We're going to, give me a second, folks. I'm just going to make sure I know what I'm being said. 2-minute warning. There you go. Speed up. We changed from talking to people and writing to people to seeing and participating in big meetings. And it's not good. We need to write stuff down. It's important that we say what we mean. And again, I don't mean email. I mean writing stuff down. So if you're working remotely, do you know these things? What's your deliverable? Right? Who is your customer for that deliverable? And who and what else do you need to get it done? And my big question always on these things is, if you can't answer what those things are, Skype and Zoom and Join Me aren't going to help you. And if you do know those things, you don't need Skype and Zoom and Join Me. And I'll use the open source projects as an example. They've been at this for a long time. All the big ones predate 2000. They've operated for a long time without Hangouts, and they're very prosperous companies or prosperous organizations. I've talked about this before. If your organization is doing these things wrong, working is hard. Remote working is really hard. You can look at that afterwards if you're interested. And again, same thing. Give the job to someone. Make it clear what they need to do. Don't try and do everything yourself. And so the biggest things you need are clarity, some metrics, and let people get on with the job. That's what you absolutely need. And I'll come back to Feynman and Einstein both said variance of, if you can't explain things well enough, that's not on anybody else. It's on you. So, figure out what it is you're trying to do and explain what you're trying to do. Last up, consistent theme. Fewer meetings than you think, more clarity than you think, more delegation than you think, and you need to write it down. Meetings like this are ephemeral. They pass away. Don't take decisions in corridors and never tell anybody what you decided. Write it down. And one last tip, no pronouns. Conversations over video conferencing about what we and he and they and it are all doing can be a bit of a disaster. You can talk to me about that another time. That's it. Hope that was interesting. Contact details are there. Get in touch with me afterwards if you've got any questions.